The letter was still wet with her tears when Kate Rourke pressed the wax seal against the envelope, her hands trembling so badly that the candle nearly tipped and set the whole thing ablaze. Outside, the wind off the Texas panhandle screamed through the cracks in the cabin walls, rattling the window panes like something furious and alive. She had written 3 drafts before this one, and she had burned them all in the hearth, watching the paper curl and blacken until the words disappeared and she could breathe again. But breathing had become its own kind of betrayal since Thomas died. Every breath she drew was one Thomas never would, and the arithmetic of that grief had worn her thinner than the soles of her winter boots. She pressed her palm flat against the sealed envelope and stared at the name she had written on the front. Gilbert Morgan, Red Creek Ranch, Holt County, Texas. She did not know if he would come. She did not know if he would even read it. What she knew, with a certainty that lived somewhere below her ribs like a lodged bullet, was that if he did not come she would lose everything. The land, the cattle, the life she had built with Thomas on ground that had cost them blood and grief and 6 years of relentless labor. She would lose it to Harlan Voss. And Harlan Voss was already circling. She had seen him 3 days ago, standing at the edge of her north pasture with his hired men, pointing at the fence line as though he were already measuring what he intended to take. He had smiled when he saw her watching from the porch. He had actually smiled, and the brazen cruelty of it had knocked the air clean out of her chest. Thomas had been in the ground less than 2 months, and Voss was already standing on her land with a surveyor's eye and a vulture's patience. Kate pressed her lips together. She was not a woman who frightened easily. She had come west at 22 with Thomas, had helped him break this ground, had buried a child in this earth long before she buried a husband. She knew what hardship looked like. She had stared it down more times than she could count. But this was different. This was a trap she could feel closing around her from every direction at once, and she had only one card left to play. She picked up the envelope and walked out into the cold black night to saddle her horse for the 3-mile ride into Caldwell, where she would hand this letter personally to Emmett Stubbs at the post office before first light, before Harlan Voss could intercept it or interfere, or do any of the dozen dark things she feared he was capable of doing. She did not know that 40 miles away, Gilbert Morgan had already saddled his horse. She did not know that he had heard the news of Thomas Rourke's death from a passing cattle driver 11 days ago, and that the news had landed on him like a physical blow to the sternum, not only because Thomas had been his oldest friend, but because the moment he heard it, Gilbert had thought of Kate. He had thought of the way she stood when she was determined about something, like she had roots going all the way down to bedrock. He had thought of her dark eyes and the sound of her voice and the particular way she laughed when something genuinely surprised her, which was not often enough in a world that kept trying to grind her down. He had told himself he was going to pay his respects. He had told himself it was nothing more complicated than that, but he had been telling himself comfortable lies his whole life, and he was getting tired of the habit. He was 3 hours into his ride before the letter even left Kate's hand. The territory that stretched between Red Creek Ranch and Kate Rourke's homestead was not kind country in November of 1878. The grass had gone the color of dried bone, and the sky hung low and gray as a wool blanket. Gilbert rode with his coat collar turned up and his hat pulled low, and the cold did not bother him particularly, because the cold was something external and simple. What was happening inside his chest was neither of those things. He had been wrestling with it for 11 days, and he was no closer to pinning it down. He had known Kate Rourke for 9 years. He had been friends with Thomas for longer than that, had ridden with him on 2 cattle drives up the Kisham Trail before Thomas settled down, and married the dark-haired woman from Missouri who had looked at Gilbert the first time they met with those frank, assessing eyes, and said, plainly, that she hoped he would be a good influence on her husband. Thomas had laughed until his face went red. Gilbert had said with equal plainness that he made no such promises. And Kate had smiled, and it had been the beginning of something that Gilbert had spent 9 years carefully not examining too closely, because Thomas was his friend, and some things you just did not do. But Thomas was gone now, and Kate was out there alone on that homestead with 60 head of cattle and a land note that Gilbert knew, from things Thomas had confided in him over the years, was not in healthy standing. Thomas had borrowed against the property twice, once after the drought in 75, and once after the fever came through the herd in 77. He had been working to pay it back, but the margins on a small cattle operation in the Texas Panhandle were thin enough to read a newspaper through, and now there was no Thomas, and Gilbert had been riding for 3 hours thinking about none of that and all of it simultaneously. He stopped at a creek crossing to water his horse and stood in the silence for a moment, watching the water move dark and cold over the stones. A hawk circled overhead, patient and unhurried. Gilbert watched it and thought about what he was actually doing, riding 40 miles in November to a dead friend's widow's homestead without an invitation, without a plan, without anything but a restless feeling that had been eating at him for 11 days straight. Then he got back on his horse and kept riding. Kate reached Caldwell before the sun was fully up, the sky bleeding orange and purple along the eastern horizon in a way that was almost obscene in its beauty. She dismounted in front of the post office and stood on the wooden boardwalk, the letter tucked inside her coat, listening to the town wake up around her. She could smell wood smoke and coffee from the hotel kitchen down the street. A dog was barking somewhere near the livery. The world was going on about its business, with a magnificent indifference to the fact that her entire future was folded up in an envelope against her sternum. Emmett Stubbs opened the post office at 6:30 sharp, the way he always did, and when he saw Kate standing there with her dark circles and her set jaw and her letter, he simply held the door open and did not say a word about the hour or the cold or the fact that she looked like she had not slept in 3 days. "How long to Holt County?" she asked. "Depending on the rider and the weather, 2 days, maybe 3. Emmett turned the letter over and looked at the address. He glanced up at her. "Gilbert Morgan, I know that name." "He was Thomas's friend," Kate said simply. Emmett nodded slowly. "I'll see it goes out on the first horse." Kate paid him, thanked him, and walked back out into the cold. She stood on the boardwalk for a long moment, her breath making small clouds in the November air, and she tried to tell herself that she had done everything she could, that the outcome was now out of her hands, that whatever happened next would happen regardless of how tightly she held her jaw or how carefully she watched the horizon. Then she rode home. What she found when she got back made her blood run cold. Harlan Voss was sitting on her porch. He was not a large man, which had always struck Kate as a particular kind of injustice, because the damage he did was large. He was lean and well-dressed for a cattle baron, with the kind of grooming that came from having other people take care of things for you. He was perhaps 45, with pale eyes that had all the warmth of a December sky, and he wore his wealth the way some men wore weapons, as a deliberate display of power. He stood when he saw her riding up, and he smiled that smile again, the one that had made her stomach clench 3 days ago at the fence line. "Mrs. Rourke," he said. "I hope I'm not intruding." "You are," Kate said. She did not dismount. She had learned a long time ago that keeping the height advantage was worth something, even if it was only psychological. "You're sitting on my porch without an invitation, Mr. Voss. That is the definition of intruding." Voss's smile did not waver. He had the particular confidence of a man who had never genuinely feared consequences. "I came to make you an offer," he said. "A generous one. I think if you heard the numbers, you might find them more than fair given your current circumstances." "My current circumstances," Kate repeated, and there was something in her voice that could have stripped paint. "You're a widow with a land note that comes due in March," Voss said, the pleasantries sliding away like a mask removed. "With 60 head of cattle and a crew of 2, in this country with these winters that is not a sustainable situation. I'm offering you a way out." "I don't want a way out," Kate said. "I want you off my porch." Voss looked at her for a long moment, and something moved in those pale eyes, something that had nothing to do with generosity or fairness. "You're a proud woman," he said. "I respect that, but pride is a luxury, Mrs. Rourke, and luxuries have a way of becoming unaffordable." "Get off my property," Kate said. He left. But he left the way a man leaves when he is certain he will be back, unhurried, with the confidence of someone who has already decided how the story ends. Kate watched him ride away and stayed in the saddle until he was a speck on the horizon, and then she sat there a moment longer before she finally dismounted, her legs unsteady, her hands tight on the reins. Inside, she built up the fire and sat at the kitchen table and tried to think clearly. March was 4 months away. The land note was $460, which was not an impossible sum but was, for her, an impossible sum. She had perhaps $180 in cash money. She had the cattle, which she could try to sell come spring, but winter prices were brutal, and she would be selling into a soft market. She had the land itself, which Voss clearly wanted for the water rights, because the creek that ran through the eastern edge of her property was one of the most reliable water sources in the county, and Voss had been trying to control the water in this valley for 3 years. Thomas had died knowing all of this. He had died knowing the pressure she would be under, and it had tormented him in his final days. She knew it had, because he had tried to talk about it and she had kept shushing him and telling him to save his strength. She had been so certain he would recover. The fever had broken twice before. She had not let herself understand that the third time was different. She put her head in her hands and sat with that for a while. Then she thought about Gilbert Morgan. She had written to him because Thomas had told her to. Not on his deathbed, not dramatically, but a year ago, in the way couples talk about practical things at night when the lamps are low, he had said, "If anything ever happened to me, you could write to Gilbert. He's solid. He would help." And Kate had said, "Nothing is going to happen to you," and Thomas had smiled at her in the darkness, and that had been the end of it. But she had remembered. She had remembered it the way you remember things that you stored away carefully, because some part of you understood they might matter someday, even when you were praying they would not. She had written Gilbert Morgan a letter that was 4 pages long, full of the facts about the land note and Harlan Voss and her financial situation, and also full of things she had not planned to say, things about Thomas and grief, and the particular loneliness of watching a life you built with someone become suddenly, brutally singular. She had written things in that letter that had surprised her as she wrote them, things that had made her sit back and look at the page and wonder what exactly she was doing. But she had sealed it and sent it anyway, because she was out of options and out of time, and because some part of her, the part she kept very quiet, had known for quite a while now that Gilbert Morgan was not just Thomas's friend. He arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, 3 days after Kate had mailed the letter and 2 days before it would reach him. Kate was at the fence on the north pasture, doing a repair that Hector, her remaining ranch hand, had been meaning to get to for a week. She saw the rider coming from a half-mile out and shaded her eyes with her hand, her heart doing something completely involuntary and unhelpful. She recognized his horse before she recognized him, a big gray gelding named Pontiac that he had been riding the last time she saw him, which had been at Thomas's funeral 2 months ago. He had stood at the grave and not cried, not because he was not feeling it, but because Gilbert Morgan did not fall apart in public. He had stood very still and very straight, and she had seen his jaw working, and she had thought in the middle of her own grief that there was something about watching a strong man hold himself together that was one of the saddest things in the world. He rode up to the fence and dismounted, and they looked at each other across the post and wire. He was 34 years old, broad-shouldered, with dark hair starting to show a little silver at the temples, and the kind of face that had been weathered by work and sun into something that was not classically handsome, but was better than that, reliable, with clear gray eyes that always seemed to be taking in more than they gave away. "Gilbert," she said. "Kate." He pulled his hat off and turned it in his hands. "I heard about Thomas. I'm sorry I didn't come sooner. I should have come sooner." "You came to the funeral. I should have stayed," he said. There was a silence that was not exactly uncomfortable but was full of things, the way silences between people who know each other well tend to be. "How did you know to come now?" Kate asked. "I sent you a letter, but it can't have reached you yet." Something shifted in his expression, something that might have been relief or confirmation. "You sent me a letter," he repeated, "3 days ago." He was quiet for a moment, looking at a point somewhere past her shoulder. "I had a feeling," he said finally. "I know that sounds thin." "It doesn't sound thin," Kate said, and she turned back to the fence because looking at him while she said that was more than she was equipped to handle right now. "It sounds like you. Come inside. I'll put coffee on." He tied Pontiac to the fence post and followed her, and the weight of his presence behind her was something she felt in her shoulder blades, like warmth from a fire you were not quite facing. She told him everything over coffee at the kitchen table: the land note, Harlan Voss and his designs on the water rights, the dwindling cash, the 60 head of cattle that would not sell for enough before March. She told him in the same flat, factual way she had written it in the letter, because if she let any emotion into it, she was going to come apart, and she refused to come apart in front of anyone, including Gilbert Morgan. He listened without interrupting, which was a quality she had always valued in him. He sat with his hands around his coffee cup and his gray eyes on her face, and he let her talk until she was done. When she finished, the kitchen was very quiet except for the wind outside. "What did you ask me for in the letter?" he said. Kate looked at the table. "I asked if you would consider loaning me the money to cover the note. $300. I have the rest." She paused. "I would pay you back by the end of next year. I have enough cattle to sell in spring, and I would have a good crop off the south field if the weather holds." "I can do that," Gilbert said immediately. "I haven't even told you the terms I was proposing." "Kate," his voice was quiet and very direct, "I can do that." She looked up at him, and the look on his face was one she did not know what to do with. It was not pity. She had been braced for pity, and she could have dealt with pity because pity had a clean edge you could push back against. This was something else. This was the look of a man who had a stake in the outcome, and the realization of that moved through her like warm water and frightened her half to death simultaneously. "I don't want charity," she said. "I know you don't. It's a loan. You said so yourself." "Gilbert, we can argue about terms later," he said. "Right now I want to talk about Voss." Kate exhaled slowly. "What about him? You said he was here 2 days ago. Has he come back?" "Not since I told him to get off my property." She watched Gilbert's jaw tighten almost imperceptibly at that. "He'll be back, though. He's not the kind of man who gives up because he's told no once." "No," Gilbert agreed. "He's not. I know his reputation." He turned his coffee cup between his palms. "His method is pressure. He makes things uncomfortable until people cut their losses and sell. He's done it to 3 other families in this county in the last 4 years. The Hendersons, the Picketts, and the Alvarez family." Kate nodded. She knew about the Alvarez family. Maria Alvarez had been a friend, the kind you saw twice a month at most because the distances were large, but a real friend, and watching that family's land get absorbed into Voss's operation had made Kate's stomach turn. "So he doesn't stop," Kate said. "He doesn't stop," Gilbert confirmed. "Unless he has reason to believe the situation has changed materially." He paused. "Would you let me stay? While I'm here, I can sleep in the barn. It's no hardship." Kate looked at him. "For how long?" "However long it takes." There was a particular quality to that offer that Kate did not know how to hold. She had been alone for 2 months. She had been managing the cattle and the land and the threat of Voss and the grief. All of it simultaneously, with only Hector in her other hand. A boy named Duffy who was 19 and earnest, and had the upper body strength to be useful, but the judgment of someone who was 19, and had never faced anything more complicated than a hard day's work. The idea of having Gilbert here, with his steadiness and his gray eyes and his way of making complex things seem manageable, was terrifying in exactly the way she had suspected it might be. "All right," she said. He moved into the barn that evening and was back at the kitchen table for supper as though he had always been there. And Kate told herself that the ease of his presence was simply familiarity, the comfort of an old friendship, and not anything more complicated than that. She told herself this while she passed him the bread, and while he told Hector a story about a cattle drive gone sideways that had Hector laughing until he had to wipe his eyes, and while Duffy sat up straighter and asked follow-up questions, because he was 19 and Gilbert Morgan was exactly the kind of man that 19-year-old boys wanted to be. After supper, when Hector and Duffy had gone back to the bunkhouse and the kitchen was quiet, Kate washed the dishes and Gilbert dried them, and they talked about Thomas. Not the death, not the grief, but Thomas himself. Stories. The time he had tried to cook a proper Christmas dinner entirely by himself and had somehow managed to set a hat on fire. The way he sang under his breath when he was working, always slightly off-key, always cheerful. The particular expression he made when he was lost in thought. He loved this place, Gilbert said quietly, setting a clean plate on the shelf. He talked about it all the time, every time I saw him. The land, the cattle, you. Kate was quiet for a moment. The dishwater was cooling. He was a good man, she said. One of the best I've ever known. He was, Gilbert agreed, and then, carefully, he would not want you to lose it. Kate dried her hands on her apron. No, she said, he would not. She went to bed that night and lay awake for a long time, listening to the wind and the distant sound of cattle, and thinking about the particular mathematics of a life that had lost one of its foundations, and was in the slow, terrifying process of trying to find its new balance. Over the next several days, Gilbert fell into the work of the ranch the way water finds the natural course of things, not by forcing his way into anything, but simply by being useful in whatever way the moment required. He rode the fence line with Hector and found 2 more sections that needed repair. He looked at the cattle and made observations about the herd that were practical and informed, the kind of observations that came from someone who had been running his own cattle operation for 8 years and knew what he was looking at. He fixed the loose hinge on the barn door that had been irritating Kate for 3 weeks. He did all of this without fanfare, without asking for credit, without making her feel like she was a problem he was solving, and that combination of competence and discretion was, Kate discovered, more dangerously appealing than she was prepared to deal with. The letter arrived on Thursday. Emmett Stubbs sent it back with the reply he had sent himself, a note explaining that Gilbert Morgan had already left for Holt County before the letter arrived, and that he had forwarded it on. Kate held the returned envelope in her hands and stood in the doorway of the post office with a feeling she could not entirely name. He had come before the letter reached him. He had come because something inside him, some kind of instinct or knowing, had pulled him in her direction before she had even formally asked. She tucked the envelope into her coat and rode home. She found him at the kitchen table when she got back, sitting with Duffy, showing the boy how to read a land survey. He looked up when she came in, and she held up the envelope, and he read the situation immediately on her face. He said something quiet to Duffy, who got up and found something to do elsewhere, and then Kate sat down across the table from Gilbert. "You were already coming," she said. He did not look away. "Yes, before I wrote to you, before you wrote to me." Kate set the envelope on the table between them. The fire popped in the hearth. The wind was quiet today, which was unusual enough that it felt like the world was holding its breath. "Why?" she asked. The word sat between them, simple and enormous. Gilbert looked at the envelope, then back at her face. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer, which was what she both feared and hoped. Then he said, "Because I have been your friend for 9 years, and it has taken everything I have to keep it at that. And when Thomas died, I sat in my house for 11 days trying to talk myself into the idea that what I felt for you was straightforward grief for a dead friend's widow, and I could not make myself believe it. And eventually, I decided that whatever the right thing to do was, sitting 40 miles away and hoping you were all right was not it." Kate looked at the table. The wood grain was old and well-worn, the same table she had eaten at with Thomas for 6 years, and she was aware of that with a particular, complicated sharpness. "Thomas told me once," she said slowly, "that if anything ever happened to him I should write to you. He said you were solid. He said you would help." She paused. "I have wondered since then whether he meant anything more than that." Gilbert was very still across the table from her. "What do you think he meant?" Kate looked up. "I think Thomas was a perceptive man," she said quietly. "I think he saw things clearly." The silence that followed was not the silence of two people who had nothing to say. It was the silence of two people standing at the edge of something enormous, trying to find their footing. "I am not asking you for anything," Gilbert said finally. "I want to be clear about that. I came because I needed to come. Whatever happens or doesn't happen, I'm going to help you with this situation with Voss and the land note, and I'm going to do it because Thomas was my friend and you are." He stopped. "I am what?" Kate said, and her voice was quieter than she intended. "Someone I care about more than I have any right to say yet," Gilbert answered. Kate pressed her lips together. The fire popped again. A gust of wind moved through the eaves with a sound like something breathing. "It's too soon," she said. "I know it is. Thomas has been gone 2 months. I know. I am not the kind of woman who—" "I know that too," Gilbert said. "I'm not asking you to be anything other than exactly what you are. I'm just telling you the truth because you asked me for it, and I've never been able to lie to you worth a damn." Kate looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the letter she had written, 4 pages, full of facts and also full of things she had not planned to say, and she thought about how much of those unplanned things she had included in the final draft that she had sealed and sent before she could second-guess herself. "I'll put supper on," she said, and Gilbert Morgan, who was not a man given to smiling without cause, smiled. The situation with Harlan Voss escalated on Saturday. Kate had known it would. She had in fact been waiting for it. The days of quiet had the feeling of weather holding before a storm, and she had been watching the horizon with that particular vigilance. What she had not anticipated was that Voss would send his men rather than come himself, and that the men he would send were the sort who understood their instructions, did not require a detailed explanation. She was at the water pump when she heard the sound of horses, too many horses for a casual visit. Gilbert was at the far north fence with Hector. Duffy was in the barn. Kate straightened up and turned to face the 3 riders who were coming through the gate at the kind of deliberate pace that was meant to communicate ownership. The man in the front was someone she recognized, a tall, broad man named Craddock who ran the day-to-day operations of Voss's spread. He had small eyes set deep under a heavy brow, and a way of looking at a situation that made you feel he was already cataloging what could be damaged. "Mrs. Rourke," Craddock said, without removing his hat. "Mr. Voss sent us to discuss the terms of your sale." "There is no sale," Kate said. Craddock looked around her property with those cataloging eyes, taking his time. "Mr. Voss is a patient man," he said, "but his patience has a practical limit. He's prepared to offer you $200 above what the land is worth on the open market, given the current condition of the note." $200 above what you think the land is worth," Kate corrected, "which is not what it's worth." Craddock looked at her directly then, and there was something in the look that was meant to be frightening. "Mr. Voss has a way of making situations clearer over time," he said. "He finds that people who initially resist his offers come to understand their situation better after a while." The implication was plain enough. Kate kept her chin level and her voice steady, though her heart was hammering. "You can tell Mr. Voss that my answer has not changed and will not change, and I would appreciate it if you take your horses off my land before I have reason to be less polite about it." Craddock held her gaze for 3 full seconds, which was the length of a small eternity, and then he smiled, slow and unpleasant. "We'll be seeing you again," he said. He turned his horse, and the 3 riders moved back toward the gate, unhurried, and Kate stood very still until they were through and the gate was behind them, and then she released the breath she had been holding. She did not hear Gilbert come up behind her until he was close enough that she could feel the shift in the air. "I saw them coming," he said quietly. I stayed back because you didn't need me charging in like I owned the place and giving Voss's men a story to carry back. Kate turned and looked at him. He had seen the whole thing. She thought about what he had said, about staying back, about not wanting to override her, and something in the way he had read that situation and acted on it made her chest ache in a way that was not entirely pain. Craddock, she said. Do you know him? I know of him. He does Voss's dirty work, and he does it without losing much sleep. Gilbert looked toward the gate, his jaw set. They're going to escalate. That visit was theater. They wanted you to feel the pressure. It worked, Kate admitted. He looked back at her, and the look on his face was fierce and quiet at the same time. I want to talk to your banker about that note, he said. I want to understand exactly what we're dealing with before we make a next move. Kate noticed the we. She filed it away. They rode into Caldwell together the following morning, and Kate introduced Gilbert to Mercer at the First Texas Banking Company, a pale, careful man who dealt in other people's misfortunes with the particular diplomacy of someone whose livelihood depended on not being blamed for them. Gilbert sat across from Mercer and asked questions with the methodical focus of someone who had navigated financial difficulties before and understood how they worked, and Kate sat beside him and watched and felt something shift in the architecture of her situation. It was not that she had been helpless before. She had not been helpless. But there was a difference between fighting alone and having someone beside you who was fully, unreservedly on your side, and she had forgotten what that felt like. The note was due in March, as she had said. $460, of which she had $180. Gilbert committed to the $300 on the spot, which made Mercer's eyebrows rise slightly, and arranged for a formal promissory note to be drawn up so everything was properly recorded. Kate signed it without argument, because she had made her peace with needing help, and she was not going to undo that peace by being proud at the wrong moment. Outside in the cold November street, Gilbert paid their horses' tie fee at the post and walked beside her toward the general store, where she needed flour and lamp oil and a few other things. The street was busy for a Tuesday morning, wagons moving, people crossing the boardwalks, the distant sound of the smith's hammer from down the block. Thank you, Kate said without looking at him. You already thanked me. I'm thanking you again. You don't have to keep thanking me, Kate, I told you. It's a loan. I know what it is, she said. I'm thanking you for how you did it, for the way you talked to Mercer, for not making it feel like rescue. She paused. Thomas was right about you. Gilbert was quiet for a moment. They were walking side by side in the cold, close enough that their arms occasionally brushed. What did Thomas say about me? Kate finally looked at him. He said you were the most decent man he'd ever known, outside of his father. He said you had a way of being strong without making other people feel small. Something crossed Gilbert's face that was difficult to read, a mixture of grief and something else, something that was looking forward rather than back. He was a better man than I am, Gilbert said simply. Stop competing with a dead man, Kate said, and the directness of it surprised them both. Gilbert stopped walking. Kate stopped a step later and turned back to look at him. They were in the middle of the boardwalk, and people moved around them on either side, and none of it mattered particularly. Is that what you think I'm doing? He asked. I think you're being careful, Kate said. I think you're treating Thomas's memory like a wall between us, and I think he would have strong feelings about that. Gilbert looked at her for a long moment. The breath misted between them in the cold air. Kate Rourke, he said quietly, you are the most direct woman I have ever met in my life. My mother said the same thing, Kate said. She thought it was a flaw. It's not a flaw, Gilbert said. They looked at each other in the cold street, and the thing between them that had been building for 9 years, patient and accumulated, was right there in the narrow air between them, perfectly visible. Come on, Kate said. I need flour. He followed her, and when she was not looking, he smiled again. The weeks that followed had a quality Kate had not experienced in a long time, the quality of days that were difficult but not impossible, of labor shared, of evenings that were warm enough to almost feel like normalcy. Gilbert stayed, as he had said he would. He worked alongside Hector with a willingness and skill that earned him the older man's deep respect, which was not easily earned. He taught Duffy things about cattle management that the boy absorbed like dry ground absorbing rain. He fixed the fence sections and looked at the south field with Kate and talked through what she might plant in spring to get the best yield. And these conversations were practical and specific, and went on for longer than they needed to because neither of them was in a hurry to stop talking. He also went to see Harlan Voss. He did not tell Kate he was going until after. He had thought about telling her first and decided that if he told her, she would want to come, and he needed to say certain things that she would not let him say if she were there, because she would be too proud to want him fighting her battles for her, and she would be right to feel that way under any other circumstances. But this was not about pride. This was about letting Voss understand that the situation had changed. He rode to the Voss spread on a Wednesday morning and was shown into Voss's study by a silent and efficient houseboy, and sat across from Harlan Voss in a leather chair and looked at the man directly. Voss was, as Kate had described, outwardly smooth. He received Gilbert with the hospitality of someone who could afford to be generous in victory, which showed that he had not yet understood that the situation was not the one he thought it was. "Morgan," Voss said, "I know your outfit over in Red Creek. You run a solid operation." "I do," Gilbert said, "which means I understand land notes and water rights and the kind of pressure you've been putting on Mrs. Rourke." Voss's expression did not change, which was itself a tell. "I've made her a fair offer. You've been circling her property since her husband was in the ground barely 6 weeks, Gilbert said, quietly but without softness. "I wouldn't call that fair. I'd call it opportunistic." "Her representative," Voss said, a slight edge entering his voice. "I'm her friend," Gilbert said, "and I'm here to tell you that the note on her land is being covered. March is not a problem, and if Craddock or anyone else who works for you comes onto her property again uninvited, I will have the county sheriff involved before sunset." He stood up. "I thought it would be more straightforward for both of us if you heard it directly rather than finding it out some other way." Voss looked up at him. The warmth in the room had evaporated entirely. "You think covering a land note is going to solve her problems? I have a long memory, Morgan." "So do I," Gilbert said. "And mine goes back to what you did to the Alvarez family. Miguel Alvarez is running cattle for someone else now because you cut his water access until he had no choice. He had children, he had a wife, and you turned that family out because you wanted their water." He held the man's gaze. "I won't let that happen to Kate Rourke, so I'd suggest you direct your attention to one of the other 100,000 acres of Texas where there is no one standing in your way." He left. Voss watched him go with those pale eyes, and the expression on his face was not defeated. It was calculating, the way a man looks when he is revising his plan rather than abandoning it. Gilbert rode back to Kate's and told her what he had done. He told her on the porch at dusk, with the sky going red and gold to the west and the cold coming down crisp and sharp, and he told her plainly because she deserved the plain version. Kate was quiet for a long moment after he finished. The light was doing something extraordinary to the horizon, and she looked at it rather than at him while she processed what he had said. "You didn't tell me you were going," she said. "No. I would have wanted to come." "I know, Gilbert, Kate." He turned to face her on the porch. "I know you can fight your own battles. I have never doubted that for a single day. But sometimes you don't have to. Sometimes someone else can take a hit for you, and it doesn't diminish you in any way. It just means you didn't have to take it alone." She looked at him then, and the last of the evening light was on his face, and she thought that she had been alone for 2 months in a way that went deeper than simply being without Thomas. She had been alone in the way of someone who was strong enough to manage but too tired to keep pretending that managing was the same as living. "He threatened you," she said. "When you said you had a long memory." "Yes. He won't let this go. Probably not immediately," Gilbert admitted. "But men like Voss move on when the return is not worth the investment. Right now we've made the return considerably less attractive." Kate nodded slowly. She was looking at the horizon again, and Gilbert was looking at her, and neither of them said anything for a while, and the silence was comfortable in a way that surprised her every time, even though it had been comfortable like this for weeks now, and she should have stopped being surprised. "Stay for supper," she said. "I'm always here for supper," he pointed out. "Stay after supper," she said, and her voice was steady but her hands were not, which she addressed by putting them in her apron pockets. Something in the air shifted. "All right," Gilbert said. After supper that night, when Hector and Duffy had gone to the bunkhouse, and the kitchen was cleaned and the fire was low and golden, Kate and Gilbert sat at the kitchen table with 2 cups of coffee, and the quiet of the night settled around them, and Kate reached across the table and put her hand over his. She did not say anything. He turned his hand over so that his palm was against her palm, and he held her hand gently, and they sat like that for a long time, and it was one of the most significant things that had ever happened to either of them, even though from the outside it was only 2 people holding hands in a warm kitchen while the fire burned down. "I don't know what I'm doing," Kate said eventually. "Neither do I," Gilbert said. "I think that's all right." "Is it? I think we're both honest people," he said. "I think honest people moving carefully is better than most alternatives." Kate looked at their joined hands on the table. "Thomas would have an opinion about this," she said. "He would absolutely have an opinion." Gilbert was quiet for a moment. "Thomas used to tell me that I needed to stop finding reasons to stay in place," he said. "He said I had a habit of choosing stillness when I should have been choosing motion. He said it like it frustrated him." He paused. I think maybe he knew what he was saying. Kate thought about her husband, about the perceptive, clear-eyed man who had loved her completely and had known her completely and had said, a year before he died, right to Gilbert. She thought about what that meant, how much love was in that instruction, how much trust in both of them. "He knew exactly what he was saying," she said quietly. She was not ready for anything more than this. This was already enormous, already required more courage than she had thought she had left. But she held Gilbert's hand, and the fire burned low, and the wind moved through the Texas night. And for the first time in 2 months, Kate Rourke did not feel like she was standing at the edge of something that was going to swallow her. December came in cold and clear, and with it came a rhythm of days that Kate would think about later as one of the most unexpectedly beautiful periods of her life. Not because it was easy, because it was not, but because it had the quality of something real and growing in the middle of difficulty. Gilbert had gone back to Red Creek Ranch to deal with his own cattle operation, which was run by a foreman named Bart who was capable but not a man who appreciated being left indefinitely without instruction. He had been gone 4 days, and Kate had found the 4 days longer than she had expected to find them. She had managed perfectly well, of course she had. She had managed the cattle and the land and the ongoing vigilance regarding Voss. But the evenings had been quieter than she was used to now, and she had sat at the kitchen table and drunk her coffee and looked at the door more than was entirely rational. He came back on the 5th day with his saddlebags full and a look on his face that made Hector grin into his coffee and made Duffy ask, with 19-year-old tactlessness, whether Mr. Morgan was planning on staying a while. "For the winter," Gilbert said, "if Mrs. Rourke will have me." Kate, who was at the stove and had her back to the room, said, without turning around, "Someone has to fix the north fence before the cold sets in properly." "I was thinking I could help with that," Gilbert said. "Then you'd better stay," Kate said. Hector's grin widened. Duffy looked confused. Gilbert took his saddlebags to the barn and felt something in his chest that he had not felt in a long time, which was the particular expansiveness of a life that was going in the right direction. December deepened and snow came once, soft and brief, dusting the pastures white before the sun took it. Kate and Gilbert worked the ranch in the cold together and talked in the evenings, and were building something in the space between them that was careful and warm and entirely specific to them. He learned the particular way she moved when she was thinking hard, a slight tightening of her expression, a stillness that was different from her ordinary stillness. She learned that he laughed with his whole face, Rarely, but when he did, it changed everything about the room. She learned that he had a habit of sitting on the porch in the early morning, even in cold weather, just for the quiet of it, and she started doing the same, and they would sit out there together in the blue pre-dawn cold with their coffee, not always talking, and it was one of the best parts of her days. He told her about his family. His mother, gone years ago from Texas fever. His father, who had built the Red Creek Ranch from nothing, and had died wanting his son to take pride in it, which Gilbert did, though the pride was mixed with the weight of solitary inheritance. He had a younger sister, Clara, who had married well and lived in Austin, and wrote him letters full of affectionate concern about the fact that he was 34 and alone. He had nearly married once, a woman named Adela, 7 years ago, but the engagement had broken off when it became clear that Adela wanted a different kind of life than the one Gilbert was building, and they had parted without bitterness, but also without much grief on either side, which had told him something important about the nature of what that had been. Kate told him about Missouri, about her parents, solid, hard-working people who had looked at her plan to go west with Thomas and had been terrified and proud in equal measure. About her sister Ruth, who still lived back east and wrote letters that were full of gentle, persistent suggestions that Kate should come back. About the child she had lost, a boy, 2 years after they arrived in Texas, and how that loss had hollowed something out of her that had never entirely filled back in. About how loving Thomas had been the most uncomplicated good thing she had ever known, and how she was trying to understand what it meant that life was asking her to learn to love again. Gilbert listened to all of it with the careful, full attention he gave everything, and when she finished talking about the child she had lost, he reached across the porch railing and took her hand without a word, and she held his hand in the cold and looked at the stars and felt the hollow place in her chest fill, just slightly, with something warm. December gave way to January, and January was hard in the way January always was in the Texas panhandle, with teeth in the wind and ice on the water pump in the mornings, and the cattle needing extra feed and extra attention. It was the kind of work that bonded people in the particular way that shared difficulty bonds people, more efficiently than easy times ever could. Voss made one more move. It was subtle, which was more concerning than something direct would have been. He began spreading rumors in Caldwell that Kate Rourke's cattle were sickly, that she was having herd losses, that the land was having drainage problems. None of it was true, but the rumors were targeted at potential buyers for her spring cattle, the idea being that if she could not sell the cattle at a reasonable price, she would struggle to repay Gilbert's loan, which would put her back in a difficult position with the note. Gilbert found out about the rumors from the cattle broker Simons, who he had gone to visit in Caldwell on Kate's behalf to discuss spring pricing. Simons was an honest man who told Gilbert plainly what he had been hearing and where it seemed to be originating. Gilbert came home that evening and sat Kate down and told her. Kate listened with a stillness that Gilbert had learned to recognize as the particular stillness of a woman choosing her response very carefully. "He's trying to cut my options," she said. "Yes, and it's working somewhat. Simon said 2 of the ranchers who were likely buyers have already started talking to other people." Kate stood up and walked to the window and looked out at the dark winter pasture. "He won't stop," she said. "I knew he wouldn't stop, you said so yourself. Threatening him just made it more personal." "Yes," Gilbert admitted. "I think I underestimated how much he dislikes being told no." Kate turned from the window and looked at him. "What do we do?" the we again. Gilbert noticed it the same way he noticed everything about her, which was thoroughly. "We fight the rumor with facts," he said. "I want to bring Dr. Henley out to do an inspection of the herd, a formal veterinary assessment, written and signed, and I want to take it to Simons and to every other potential buyer in the county. I want it on record that your herd is healthy." Kate nodded slowly. "That will cost money, not much, and it'll pay for itself if it keeps your spring prices where they need to be." "All right," Kate said. She looked at him steadily. "Gilbert, I need to say something." "Say it." I have been thinking about what you said the first week you were here, about having cared for me for 9 years and not letting yourself say it." She stopped. She was doing the thing where her hands were not entirely still, which she was managing by keeping them at her sides. "I have been thinking about the letter I sent you, the one that didn't reach you in time." She paused again. "I wrote things in that letter that I have been pretending were just the practicalities of the situation." Gilbert was very still. "They weren't just practicalities," Kate said. The fire crackled. The wind moved through the eaves. "Kate," Gilbert said very quietly. "I am not ready to put words to it yet," she said, her voice steady but her eyes bright. "I am still. There are still days when I reach for Thomas and find empty air, and those days are hard, and I need you to know that I'm not asking you to be Thomas. I am not asking you to be anything other than what you are. But what you are is," she stopped. "What you are is someone I am very glad is here." Gilbert stood up from the table and crossed the room to where she was standing and took her face in his hands and looked at her for a long moment, and then he kissed her. Once, gently, and then he drew back and looked at her again, and she had her hands on his arms and her eyes were closed. "I have been wanting to do that for 9 years," he said. Kate opened her eyes. "Don't make it exactly 9 years," she said. "That has uncomfortable implications." "Fair enough." His thumbs moved along her cheekbones. 6 weeks then." "Better," Kate said. She stood on her toes and kissed him back. January turned into February, and February was the month when everything both hardened and clarified. The veterinary inspection of the herd came back clean and detailed, and Gilbert took the written assessment personally to every cattle buyer in the county and let them read it, and the rumor began to die the slow death of lies confronted with facts. Simons came back with a fair spring price and 2 solid buyers, and Kate sat at her kitchen table looking at the numbers and felt the grip around her chest loosen by a measure that was physically noticeable. Voss made no more direct moves. Whether this was because he was waiting, regrouping, or had genuinely decided the return was not worth the investment, Kate could not be certain. But the weeks of quiet gave her enough breathing room to look forward rather than simply sideways, and looking forward was something she had not done in months. She and Gilbert moved carefully, deliberately, with the particular care of 2 people who had each been shaped by loss and who understood, at a bone-deep level, that what they were building was not something to be rushed. There were evenings on the porch in the February cold, wrapped in coats, close enough together that she could feel the warmth of him through the layers. There were long conversations about the future, not abstract future, but the specific, practical future that people build when they are building together. What might be planted in the south field, whether adding to the herd in autumn made sense, whether the cabin needed a new roof before another winter. There were also harder conversations, the ones where Kate admitted that some mornings she still cried before she got out of bed, and the ones where Gilbert told her about the years of chosen solitude and why he had chosen them, and the ones about fear, about what it meant to want something this much when life had already demonstrated its willingness to take things away. Those conversations happened in the kitchen or on the porch or sometimes while they were working, emerging organically from the accumulated trust of months spent in each other's presence. One evening in late February, with March and the resolution of the land note only days away, Kate sat at the table across from Gilbert and said, "I need to ask you something." "Ask me." "What happens after March? After the note is paid and the immediate crisis is resolved?" She looked at him directly. "You have your own ranch, you have your own operation. Red Creek is 40 miles from here." She paused. "What is this, Gilbert? What are we doing?" He had been expecting this question. He had been thinking about it for weeks, because he was a man who thought things through before he spoke, and this was not a question he was going to answer carelessly. "I want to marry you," he said. The words landed in the quiet kitchen with a weight that was not heavy but was significant, the weight of something real. Kate was quiet for a moment. The firelight moved across her face. "That is the most straightforward thing anyone has ever said to me," she said. "I know what I want," Gilbert said simply. "I have known it for a while. I'm not asking you right now. I am telling you what I want so that you know where I stand and so you can tell me where you stand." Kate looked at her coffee cup. She turned it slowly in her hands, watching the dark liquid move. "I stand," she said carefully, "in the position of someone who wants the same thing eventually and who is frightened of it because wanting something this much feels dangerous." "I understand that," Gilbert said. "I know you do." She looked up at him. "I need a little more time, Gilbert, not much, but some." "Take all the time you need," he said. "I'm not going anywhere." "You keep saying that." "Because it keeps being true." March arrived, and with it the resolution of the land note, paid in full, recorded properly, witnessed by Mercer at the bank, who shook both their hands with the professional warmth of a man whose job was occasionally gratifying. Kate stood outside the bank on the Caldwell boardwalk and held the paid receipt in both hands and breathed the cold March air, and felt something release in her that had been tightly coiled for months. Gilbert stood beside her, their arms touching, looking at the street. "It's done," Kate said. "It's done," he agreed. She turned and looked at him, and she was smiling, the particular smile that was rare because life had not given her many excuses for it, and it changed her face entirely, and Gilbert thought not for the first time that the rest of his life needed to include that smile as often as possible. "Ask me," she said. He looked at her. "What? You said you were not asking me then. Ask me now." "Kate Rourke," Gilbert said without hesitation, "will you marry me?" "Yes," she said. "I will." He took her face in his hands right there on the boardwalk in the cold March morning with the town moving around them on either side, and he kissed her, and it was the kind of kiss that people around them pretended not to notice while absolutely noticing, and Kate laughed against his mouth, which was better than anything. They were married in April. It was a simple ceremony, because Kate was not a woman who needed ceremony to make something real. The town preacher came to the homestead on a Sunday afternoon when the spring had come in green and generous, and the pastures were alive with new grass. Hector and Duffy were there, and Emmett Stubbs from the post office, and several neighbors who had watched the winter unfold and had their own opinions about how things should go, which they kept largely to themselves out of respect for the occasion. Kate wore a dress she had made from fabric she had ordered from Caldwell in February, a deep blue that matched the sky overhead, and she stood with Gilbert in the spring sunshine and said her vows with the steady, clear voice of a woman who had thought about every word and meant all of them. Gilbert said his vows looking directly at her the entire time, holding her hands, and his voice was quiet but absolutely certain, and there was not a person present who doubted for a second that he meant every syllable. They signed the papers. Emmett Stubbs witnessed them. Hector looked at the ground and cleared his throat several times in a way that was not fooling anyone. Duffy cheered, which seemed to startle him more than anyone else. The homestead became, officially and legally, their homestead. Kate Rourke became Kate Morgan, though she used both names because the Rourke was part of her history, and she did not intend to put it entirely away, and Gilbert had never suggested she should. They combined the operations gradually and sensibly. Red Creek Ranch had a solid foreman in Bart, and they kept him on, and the two operations complemented each other in ways that the practical economics of their situation made advantageous. Bart's management of Red Creek freed Gilbert to be present at what was now the Morgan homestead in Holt County for the majority of the time, with regular visits to Red Creek to ensure things were running well. It was not an arrangement that would have worked forever in its initial form, but it worked for the first year while they found their footing, and during that year a great deal happened. The spring cattle sale went well. The prices Simons had quoted held, and the buyers he had brought were legitimate and paid promptly, and Kate had the loan to Gilbert repaid by September, which she insisted on formalizing in writing at the bank the same way they had formalized the original agreement, because she was her mother's daughter in the matter of contracts and clear records. Voss, for his part, had moved on. Not graciously and not finally, but his attention had shifted to a property further west where the owner was older and less well supported, and while Kate thought about that with a complicated mixture of relief and guilt, She could not fight every battle simultaneously. She wrote a letter to the sheriff's office in that county, laying out what she knew about Voss's methods, and she signed it with her full name, and she hoped it would do some good. Gilbert read the letter before she sent it and said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "I would have done the same thing." And Kate had said, "I know," and they had gone on with the morning. The summer was long and warm and full of work, the good kind of work that builds rather than merely maintains. They planted the south field as they had planned, and it produced well. They added 12 head to the herd, carefully selected, with an eye toward quality that would pay dividends in the years to come. They painted the cabin exterior before the summer heat cracked the wood, and added a room off the back which doubled as a storage space and, with a bit of work, would be something more when the time came. On a Wednesday evening in August, Kate sat Gilbert down at the kitchen table with supper cooling between them and told him she was expecting. He sat very still for a long moment, looking at her face. Kate, who had been managing the weight of this knowledge for 2 weeks while she tried to find the right moment, watched him carefully. Then his face did something she had only seen a handful of times, that full, rare smile, and he got up from the table and came around to where she was sitting and pulled her up into his arms and held her. "Are you all right?" he said into her hair. "I am more than all right," she said. "I am frightened and more than all right simultaneously." "That seems about right," he said. She held on to him and felt the warmth of his arms and thought about the baby boy she had buried in this ground years ago. And she let herself feel that grief alongside this new hope, because they were both part of her, and she was not in the habit of pretending otherwise. "If it's a boy," she said, "I want to name him Thomas." Gilbert was quiet for a moment, his arms still around her. Then he said, "I think that's exactly right. You're not going to argue for a family name." "Thomas was family," Gilbert said simply. Kate pulled back just far enough to look at him, and his eyes were bright, and she thought that she had done a good thing in writing that letter, even if it had arrived after he was already on his way. She thought that Thomas had done a good thing in knowing what he knew and saying what he had said, a year before he died, in the darkness of the bedroom they had shared for 6 years. She thought that life had a particular way of being generous and brutal simultaneously, and that the generosity was worth more than the brutality cost. She kissed her husband. He kissed her back. The autumn of 1879 was one of the most beautiful Kate Morgan had ever seen, which she suspected was partly the season and partly the particular way that happiness makes the visible world more vivid. The pastures went gold and rust, and the sky over the Texas panhandle had a depth of blue that she had never stopped marveling at in all the years she had lived under it. She and Gilbert rode the property in the evenings when the work was done, not for any practical purpose, but because the land was beautiful and they were not tired of looking at it together. She wrote to her sister Ruth in Missouri. A long letter, the kind she had not written in years, full of news and detail, and the kind of life-describing that people do when something in them wants to be witnessed by someone who has known them since childhood. She told Ruth about Gilbert, about the months of winter and the land note, and the slow, careful building of something she had not planned for, about the wedding in the spring sunshine, about the baby coming in March, which she had not yet told her sister because she had been waiting until she was certain enough to say the words without them feeling fragile. Ruth wrote back within 3 weeks, and the letter was full of warmth and relief, and the particular kind of sister happiness that does not perform itself, but is simply and genuinely present. She said she was coming to visit in the spring. She said she wanted to meet this man who had ridden 40 miles because he had a feeling. She said Kate sounded, for the first time in a long time, like herself. Kate read the letter at the kitchen table while Gilbert was outside with Hector, and she folded it carefully and pressed it flat and thought about what it meant to sound like yourself. She thought it meant something like this, like a morning you woke up and the weight was still there, all of it, the grief and the history and the complexity of being alive in a world that did not hold back, but you were not being crushed by it. You were carrying it, and someone was carrying it with you. December came back around, and with it the first anniversary of Gilbert's arrival. Kate mentioned it over supper, a Tuesday evening with the fire high and the snow outside soft and new. "1 year ago today," she said, "you rode up to my fence without being asked and stood there turning your hat in your hands." "I remember," Gilbert said. "You looked like a man who was not entirely sure what he was doing." "I was not entirely sure what I was doing," he said. "I had several conversations with myself on the ride about the appropriate definition of paying one's respects." Kate smiled. "And where did those conversations come out?" "They came out with me at your fence at 3 in the afternoon." He leaned back in his chair and looked at her across the table, comfortable and particular. "I am glad they did." "So am I," Kate said. She reached across the table. He met her hand halfway. Winter passed again. The new addition off the back of the cabin was finished by Christmas, painted and furnished with careful economy, ready for what was coming. Hector had been with Kate long enough to feel entitled to an opinion about the paint color, which he expressed quietly and at length, and the final color was, in Kate's estimation, exactly right, and she would not have picked it without him. Thomas Gilbert Morgan was born on a Thursday morning in late March of 1880, just as the first spring warmth was making the kind of tentative promise that the Texas panhandle offered every year, enough warmth to believe in, not yet enough to trust entirely. He was born in the room where his mother had lived and grieved and written a letter at midnight with her hands trembling, in the house that sat on the land that had cost everything and been worth every cost. He was born healthy and loud and demanding, which Hector said was a good sign, and which Duffy, who had been waiting outside in the cold for 2 hours, took as his cue to make a sound that was embarrassingly close to a shout of joy. Gilbert sat beside Kate on the bed while she held their son, and he looked at the two of them with the expression of a man who has arrived somewhere he did not fully let himself believe he was going to reach, and Kate looked up at him and said, "Thomas." "Thomas," Gilbert said, and his voice had a quality that had no clean name but was made of several things at once, grief and gratitude and love, and the particular wonder of a life that keeps happening even when you have stopped being able to predict it. The baby opened his eyes and looked at them with the unfocused, entirely serious expression of someone encountering existence for the first time and finding it deserving of examination. "He looks like he has questions," Gilbert said. "So did his mother," Kate said, "from the first day." Ruth came from Missouri in May as she had promised, arriving on the stage to Caldwell in a cloud of practical luggage and barely contained feeling. And she took one look at her sister holding that baby on the porch and started crying before she was off the steps, which Kate had not seen her do since their father's funeral, and which meant more than any letter could have. She met Gilbert that first evening at supper, and she watched him the way a sister watches, carefully and with the full benefit of personal history. And at the end of the meal she found a moment when Kate was out of the room and she said to Gilbert, plainly and without preamble, "My sister wrote to me. She told me what happened, all of it." She looked at him. "You came before she asked you. You covered her note, you faced down Voss, and then you waited." Gilbert looked at her. "She needed time." Ruth nodded slowly. "She did, and you knew that." She paused. "Thomas was a good man, and Kate loved him truly, and I'm not going to pretend he didn't exist. But you did exactly the right things in exactly the right order, and I wanted you to know that someone who loves her noticed." "Thank you," Gilbert said. Ruth looked at the door Kate had gone through, and there was the fullness of long love in her expression. "Take care of her," she said. "Every day," Gilbert said. Kate came back into the room with Thomas on her hip, the baby wide-eyed and grabbing at her collar, and the conversation settled back into the warmth of supper and family, and the particular contentment of a table full of people who were glad to be there. Ruth stayed 2 weeks. She helped with the baby and argued pleasantly with Hector about the best way to put up preserves, and took long walks in the evening that she said were about the landscape, but were clearly about the quality of quiet, which the Texas panhandle had in abundance. She went home to Missouri with her luggage and her observations, and a particular look on her face that Kate recognized as the look of someone whose worries have been answered. The second year of their marriage was different from the first in the way that second years always are, more settled. The newness deepened into something more durable. Thomas was growing with the energetic determination of a healthy boy, and the ranch was growing alongside him. And Kate and Gilbert were growing together in the specific way of two people who have seen each other in difficulty and ease and grief and joy, and have found, in all of that, sufficient reason to keep choosing. Kate thought sometimes about the letter, the one she had written at midnight with trembling hands, the one that had been wet with her tears when she sealed it. She had it still, the returned copy that Emmett Stubbs had sent back with the note that Gilbert had already left. She kept it in the small cedar box that had belonged to her mother, alongside the original land deed, and Thomas Rourke's watch and a pressed flower from the small grave on the eastern edge of the property that she visited every spring. These things were her history. They were the whole of who she was, and Gilbert had never once asked her to put any of it away. He knew where the box was. He knew what was in it. He had asked her once, early in their marriage, if she wanted to tell him about the first Thomas, the boy she had lost. She had told him the whole of it, all the way through, and he had listened and held her hand, and afterward he had said only that he was sorry and the simplicity of it had been exactly right. She had a good life. It was not the life she had originally built, and she did not pretend it was. It was a different life, built on the foundation of the first one, and extended by something she had not planned for and would not have wished for under the circumstances that had made it possible. But it was real, and it was rich, and it was hers. In the spring of 1881, when the South Field was yielding its third good crop, and Thomas was a year old, and already expressing strong opinions about everything, Kate Morgan sat on the porch in the early morning the way she had come to love, the way she and Gilbert had sat together in the cold the winter he first arrived. The light was just coming up over the eastern horizon, soft gold and pink, and the pastures were green, and the cattle were moving in the distance with their slow, self-contained purposefulness. Gilbert came out with 2 cups of coffee and sat beside her and handed her one, and they sat in the morning quiet together, the way they did most mornings. "I have been thinking," Kate said. "That seems consistent with your general habits," he said. "I want to put a proper headstone on the grave," Kate said. "For the baby, I've been thinking about it for a while, a proper stone with his name." Gilbert was quiet for a moment. What was his name, he asked. He had not asked before. She had told him some things and not others, and he had never pushed. "James," Kate said. "James Rourke." "Then we'll get him a stone," Gilbert said. Kate nodded. She looked at the horizon. The light was coming in full now, warming the whole of the Texas morning. "And I want to write to the sheriff in the western county about Voss again. I had a letter from Maria Alvarez last week. She said the family he went after out there is struggling. I want to put what I know in writing formally for the record." "We can do that today," Gilbert said. "And I think Thomas needs a dog," Kate said. "He's getting to the age where a boy needs a dog. He's 13 months old. It'll take a while for the dog to get to the right age too. They can grow up together." Gilbert looked at her with the full warmth of his gray eyes. "You have it all planned out." "I have it somewhat planned out," Kate corrected. "The rest of it I'm making up as I go." "That," Gilbert said, "seems about right." He reached over and took her hand, and they sat like that in the morning light, and the coffee was warm, and the land was green, and the baby was asleep inside, and the world, for all its difficulty and darkness and the plain injustice of so many of its arrangements, had moments, genuine and unearned and luminous moments, that made the whole long argument of living worth every word. Kate held her husband's hand on the porch and looked at the country she had broken herself open to build, the country that had cost her and given back and cost her again, and she felt something she recognized after some examination as peace. Not the peace of absence, not the absence of difficulty or grief or the acute awareness of all that she had lost, the peace of completion, of a life that had been tested and had not broken, of a love that had come at the right time and in the right way and had asked of her exactly what she was capable of giving. The sun was fully up now, the day beginning in earnest. "Come on then," Kate said, and stood and carried her coffee inside to face whatever the day was going to bring. Gilbert followed her in. He always did. Years later, when Thomas Morgan was old enough to ask about the cedar box and what was in it, Kate sat with him at the kitchen table and told him. She told him about his namesake, Thomas Rourke, who had been a good man and a brave man, and who had loved his land with the kind of love that endures. She told him about James, the brother he had never met, who was buried in the eastern corner of the property under a proper stone. She told him about the winter that his father had ridden 40 miles through the cold because something inside him had pulled him in the direction of someone who needed him, before the letter even arrived. Thomas sat with his elbows on the table, listening with the intense, unhurried focus of a child who understands that this story is about him in some way that he cannot yet fully articulate. "Did he know he was going to marry you?" Thomas asked. "He thought he might be coming to help," Kate said. "I think he was hoping for the rest." "And you knew you were going to marry him?" Kate thought about this for a moment. She thought about the letter she had written at midnight, 4 pages, full of facts and also full of things she had not planned to say. "I knew that I was very glad he came," she said. "The rest followed from that." Thomas considered this with the philosophical seriousness of a 7-year-old, who was accustomed to his mother's directness and his father's patience, and who had grown up watching two people treat each other with a combination of honesty and care that he would spend his entire adult life trying to replicate. "Can I see the letter?" he asked. Kate opened the cedar box and took it out. The paper had yellowed at the edges, but the words were still clear, her own handwriting, that late-night urgency still visible in the pressure of the pen on the page. Thomas looked at it carefully. He could read most of it, the letters and the words he had been taught. He stopped at the part where the facts ended and the other things began, the unplanned things she had put down in the late-night hours when she had been too honest to stop herself. He looked up at his mother. "What does this part say?" Kate looked at what he was pointing to. She had not read this part in a long time. She read it now. She had written, "I don't know if this is the right thing to say in a letter asking for practical help, and I have already burned 3 drafts of this, and so I am simply going to say it now before I lose the nerve for it. Thomas told me you were solid. He told me you would help." What he did not say, what I do not know if he knew, is that there have been moments over the years, quiet moments I have kept very carefully to myself, when I thought that if things had been different, if the world had arranged itself differently, the person I might have wanted beside me was you. I am saying this not to ask for anything, and not to make anything complicated. I am saying it because I am alone at midnight and I am frightened, and I am sending this letter and I may not get another chance to say it, and it seems important to have said it at least once. Kate folded the letter. "It says," she told her son, "that your mother was very glad your father existed." Thomas nodded, satisfied by this, and climbed down from the table and went off to find his dog, who was somewhere in the yard being enormously unhelpful with the chickens. Kate sat at the table alone for a moment and held the letter. Gilbert came through the door from outside, stamping dust off his boots, and he looked at her sitting there and at the letter in her hands, and he understood what she had been doing the way he understood most things about her, completely and without needing it explained. He sat down across from her. "You all right?" he said. "I am absolutely all right," Kate said. She set the letter on the table between them and looked at her husband, this man who had ridden 40 miles through a cold November on instinct and friendship, and the honest acknowledgement of something he had been carrying for years, who had stood at her fence turning his hat in his hands, who had sat across this very table and told her the truth because he had never been able to lie to her worth a damn, who had given her $300 and a paid land note, and a real headstone for James and a dog for Thomas and 13 years of mornings, with coffee on the porch, and the absolute, undeviating faithfulness of someone who means it when they say they are not going anywhere. She looked at him and felt the entire weight of her life, all of it, and it was not too heavy. It was exactly the right weight. "I was just reading the letter," she said. "The letter," Gilbert said, and something in his voice was soft. "Which one? The one that didn't reach you in time." He was quiet for a moment. His hands were flat on the table. The morning light came through the kitchen window and lay warm and even across everything. "I have thought about that a lot over the years," he said. "About you sitting here at this table in the middle of the night writing it. What do you think about when you think about it?" "I think about how brave it was," he said simply. "To write the truth even knowing you didn't have to. You could have kept the letter practical. You could have kept it to the facts." "I almost did," Kate said. "I burned 3 drafts, but you didn't burn the 4th." "No," she said, "I didn't burn the 4th." He reached across the table and took the letter and folded it carefully and put it back in the cedar box and closed the lid. Then he took her hands in his. "I came before you asked," he said. "I would always come before you asked. You know that." "I know that," Kate said. Outside, Thomas was shouting something cheerful and incomprehensible at his dog, and the dog was responding with equal enthusiasm, and the cattle were moving in the pasture under the spring sky, and the south field was green with the new crop, and the stone at James Rourke's grave was clean and properly lettered and visible from the kitchen window on clear mornings, and the first Thomas Rourke's watch was in the cedar box alongside the letter, and all of this was held together by the land itself. By the specific, difficult, generous ground that Kate had come to at 22 and broken herself against and built herself upon, and it held everything she had ever lost and everything she had ever built in the whole long, costly, luminous argument of her life. "Come on," Gilbert said, and they went together out into the morning.